Hi guys, I'm demonstrating from a student perspective. I joined the Google Classroom as a student, how to go more in depth with what you're actually required to do this week. Okay, so first things first, you need to find our assignment by either clicking here or coming up to the top and clicking classwork. So then you need to click either that where it says Romeo and Juliet analytical task or view your work. So once you click on the task right here, it's going to come up with your document with your name on it. Now keep in mind that you are the only person who can edit this document, okay? And the only person who can see what you're writing is me and you, okay? So, who or what really killed Romeo and Juliet? In an analytical essay, not due yet. Do not write the essay this week. We're only doing part one. Okay, you're going to explore which factors are most responsible for the deaths of the title characters in Shakespeare's play. So, for your essay, which you are not writing this week, you are eventually going to argue one of the following thesis statements. Okay, and we're going to go more in depth with the thesis statements in a minute, but there are 4 thesis statements here. We need to find 3 examples each. Okay, so if you scroll down to the second page, this is where you are going to write your examples. It says find 3 examples from the play for each thesis statement. You don't need to write down actual quotes right now, just write down the examples and the page numbers. So, the first thesis statement, Romeo and Juliet's inability to separate love from violence through their words and actions ultimately leads to their untimely deaths. Now, we've talked a lot about how Romeo and Juliet tend to be a bit dramatic, right? And what this thesis statement is essentially saying is that the two of them, because they, went too quickly, are ultimately responsible for their deaths. Now, an example of this could be Romeo when he gets banished from Verona. So, as you can see, what I'm typing. After Romeo's deadly fight with Tybalt, the prince banishes him from Verona. Romeo tells Friar Lawrence that he would rather be dead than banished. Okay? So because he would rather die than be banished, he's not accepting the prince's mercy because he can't be with Juliet. Obviously, what you would argue with this example is how that is ultimately going to lead to the deaths of Romeo and Juliet because he's not being rational and logical. And where we find this, pages 111 to 113. Statement number 2. Romeo's impulsivity and inability to consider the consequences before acting are what ultimately lead to his and Juliet's deaths. Now, a perfect example of this is that after he meets Juliet at the Capulets' party, he immediately goes to Juliet's, we say balcony, even though we talked about how it's not really a balcony, and he pressures Juliet into committing to him immediately. Now, this is somebody he had met just maybe like an hour prior, right? So the fact that he is already pressuring her to commit herself to him sends up a lot of red flags. Especially the fact that we know that he had just been in love with Rosalind maybe 2 hours ago, right? So what you would be arguing in this thesis statement is that it's ultimately Romeo's fault for causing their deaths. Now, thesis statement number 3 says regardless of the choices they make or the pressure society places on them, fate is ultimately responsible for their deaths. So, a perfect example of fate is the day that Romeo and Juliet get married, is the day that Tybalt decides to challenge Romeo to a duel, which leads to his death and leads Juliet's father to say, okay, well, Juliet's grieving. We should move up her marriage to Paris, right? And because her marriage to Paris is moved up, that's what, puts into effect the whole Juliet is going to fake her own death and etc., etc. So if you are arguing this thesis statement, you need to focus on the fact that there are a lot of terrible, terrible things that happen all because of fate. Now we find this example on pages 121 and 123. The last example of a thesis statement is the pressures put upon Romeo and Juliet from their duties to their families ultimately lead to their deaths. So the most obvious example of this is going to be the family feud. So if Romeo and Juliet don't need to hide their love from anybody, then none of this ever happens, right? They take things much slower. They're not doing things in secret. Maybe they're actually having a real wedding instead of having a wedding with Friar Lawrence and the nurse. Okay? So, a perfect example that you could write down is had their families not been feuding, Romeo and Juliet would have never had to hide their love in the first place, which, ultimately would have resulted in them taking their time and living. The example I put here is page 55 because that's when Romeo and Juliet consider their love. Consider their love saying, had you not been a Montague, everything would have been perfect, and etc., etc. So ultimately, I hope this sheds some light on what's expected of you for this week. Please, please let me know if things are still unclear. And remember, do not write your essay. Please, you do not write the essay. Okay, bye.